My name is Detective James Carver. I've seen enough crime scenes to know when something isn't right, but nothing prepares you for what you find when evil doesn't just take a life, it lingers. By the way, if you're listening to this story in the middle of the night, or lying in a dark room, or somewhere on your way home, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so every time I tell a new story, you'll be the first to hear it in the right place at the right time. Hinterkaifeck wasn't a town, it was barely even a name. A small farmstead tucked away in the cold countryside of Bavaria, Germany. Dirt roads, thick woods, neighbors far enough away that a scream might never reach them. In 1922, the farm was home to the Gruber family. Andreas, the father, a harsh, often cruel man in his 60s. Cecilia, his wife, quiet and aging, worn down by the years. Their daughter, Victoria, a widow with two children. Little Cecilia, just 7, and baby Joseph, barely 2 years old. And then there was Maria Baumgartner, a maid who'd only just arrived. A house of 6 souls, caught in the ordinary grind of rural life. But just days before the slaughter, something shifted. Andreas mentioned strange things to neighbors, noises in the attic, footsteps where no one should be. A newspaper from Munich found in the snow, though no one had bought it. The keys to the house vanishing without a trace. And on the edge of the woods, fresh footprints in the snow leading toward the farmhouse, but never away. People talk about fear in different ways. Sometimes it's loud, panic, screaming, but sometimes it's quiet, a heaviness in the air, a tension that settles over a place like fog. That's what Hinterkaifeck became. The farm wasn't well loved in the community. Andreas had enemies and whispers of dark secrets. Neighbors didn't visit unless they had to. The family kept to themselves, isolated and uneasy. Then, on March 30th, the maid who had worked there for years quit. She told anyone who'd listened that the house was haunted. She couldn't take the sounds, the strange movements, the sense that someone or something was watching. Her replacement, Maria, arrived the next day. By evening, the house looked the same as it always had. The animals were fed. The chimney smoked. From the road, you'd think life went on as normal, but something or someone had already decided that Hinterkaifeck would not see another sunrise. When you work enough cases, you learn to read the quiet before the storm. The little things that tell you people knew, deep down, that something was coming. That's what haunts me about Hinterkaifeck. The Grubers carried on, but neighbors would later recall how Andreas had locked the doors that night, tighter than usual. How Victoria sang softly to her children, her voice carrying faintly across the fields. How the wind whistled through the eaves like a warning, but no one listened. 6 people, 6 souls, alone, in that house. And someone else, maybe just one person, waiting in the dark, patient, steady, ready. By morning, the farm would be silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy, oppressive kind. The kind that clings to you years later. And that's where we start. Because to understand the horror of what came next, you have to feel that quiet. You have to know that in that moment, just before it began, Hinterkaifeck was alive. And the people inside were just trying to live. The days leading up to the murders were ordinary on the surface. Milking cows, tending fields, mending fences. But the smallest details started to stand out, even decades later, in police reports and interviews. Andreas' talk about the footprints, the sound of something moving overhead at night, the way little Cecilia clung tighter to her mother's skirts. Even the dogs, loyal and restless, barking at shadows in the corners of the yard. The story of Hinterkaifeck isn't just about the violence. It's about that creeping dread, that slow build of something terrible, like a storm on the horizon you can't quite see but you know is coming. I think about that a lot. How fear can live with you quietly, how you can get used to it, even when you shouldn't. and how sometimes we mistake the ordinary for safety until it's too late. The Grubers didn't know it, but they had already been chosen. By who or why, no one can say for sure, but the pieces were falling into place. The road was muddy that week. No one saw strangers come or go, but the woods were thick, the paths easy to miss. And if someone wanted to watch the house, to study it, to wait for the right time, they could have, easily. By the night of March 31st, that quiet fear, the kind you almost forget is there, had settled over Hinterkaifeck for the last time. The next part of this story, that's when the silence broke. The night of March 31st, 1922. The kind of night when the wind carries every sound farther than it should, every footstep, every creak, every breath. Inside Hinterkaifeck, life went on as usual, or so it seemed. The animals were in their stalls, the house was locked, and 6 people prepared for what they thought would be just another cold night in Bavaria. But someone else was there, watching, waiting. The first blow came in the barn. Andreas went out first. Maybe he heard something, a sound in the dark, the animals restless. Maybe it was just habit, checking the doors before bed. Then Cecilia followed him, his wife, then Victoria, and finally little Cecilia, the 7-year-old, clutching her mother's hand, stepping into the barn. One by one they were led outside. No one screamed loud enough to be heard. No one ran. Whoever was waiting for them knew what they were doing. They struck with a mattock, a heavy farm tool, sharp enough to split bone, blunt enough to break a man's skull in a single swing. And when it was done, the barn was quiet again. Bodies in the hay, blood soaking the dirt floor, and the killer not finished. Inside the farmhouse, 2 more souls waited. Maria, the new maid barely a day into her job, and baby Joseph, asleep in his crib. Maria never saw her attacker. She died in her bed, the sheets soaked red. Joseph, just a child, not even old enough to speak, was struck in his crib. 6 people, dead, and the farm, silent. But the story didn't end there, because whoever killed them stayed. Neighbors grew uneasy over the weekend. The Grubers didn't show up at church. The children missed school. The farm looked still, almost too still, but the chimney smoked during the day. People assumed they were busy, maybe sick. But by Tuesday, April 4th, the silence was too much. Neighbors gathered and approached the farmhouse. What they found inside would scar them forever. The barn was first. 4 bodies lined up, straw tossed over them like a crude shroud. Andrea's face, unrecognizable, split open. Victoria, her hair tangled in blood and hay. Cecilia, the little one, her small fists clutching strands of her own hair, as if she'd torn at herself in terror, alive for a few minutes after the attack. Inside the house, the nightmare continued. Maria's body in the bed, baby Joseph's lifeless form in his crib. The killer hadn't just slaughtered them, they'd lived in the house afterward. The animals were fed, food had been eaten, footprints showed movement between the rooms, and in the attic, signs of someone sleeping there. Think about that for a moment. Someone murdered 6 people, then stayed, lived among the dead, ate their food, cared for their animals, waited. For what? No one knows. It's the kind of detail that chills you in a way nothing else can. Because it tells you this wasn't random. It wasn't rage. It was patience. It was control. Investigators arrived and did what they could. But 1922, Bavaria wasn't built for a case like this. The crime scene was trampled by curious neighbors. Evidence was moved, destroyed. Autopsies were done, but with limited tools and experience. Still, certain things stood out. The doors were locked. The attack was methodical. Each victim struck with precision. There were no signs of theft, money, valuables, nothing was taken. And those footprints in the snow, days before the murders, now made sense. The killer had been there. watching, waiting. The barn told its own story. There were no signs of a struggle. Each person walked in, one by one, unaware of what was waiting. That takes planning, patience, and a level of familiarity with the victims, or at least with their routines. Little Kazilia's final moments told another story. She'd lived for some time after her skull was shattered, long enough to tear at her own scalp in agony and fear, long enough to know what had happened to the people she loved. It's the kind of detail that makes even a detective go quiet, because it's one thing to understand the mechanics of a crime. It's another to picture what that little girl saw in her final moments. For days after, people whispered about the footprints, about the noises Andreas had heard, about the missing keys, all the little warnings they'd ignored. And then there were the oddities, small but impossible to forget. A candle burned low in the attic, food eaten from the kitchen, fresh tracks in the snow leading nowhere. Whoever did this hadn't rushed. They'd taken their time. And when they left, whenever they finally left, they vanished like smoke. I've stood in enough crime scenes to know that violence leaves a mark, not just on the bodies, not just on the walls and floors, but on the people who walk through that door long after the blood is cleaned and the case goes cold. Hinterkaifeck was no different. Neighbors couldn't look at the farmhouse without feeling that chill. Even when it was torn down years later, the land felt wrong. And the questions, they never stopped. Who had done it? Why? How could someone walk into that house, kill 6 people, stay there for days, and disappear without a trace? The answers, or at least the theories, would come, but none of them, not one, could make sense of the silence that followed the screams. The investigation that followed was chaotic. Too many hands touched the evidence. Too many voices drowned out the quiet fact. But one thing was clear. This was no robbery, no random act. Someone had a reason to kill the Grubers, and maybe someone close. The first suspect was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's late husband, reported killed in the First World War. Some whispered he had faked his death, returned, and found his wife with another man. But there was no proof, only gossip and fear. Then there was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor. He'd had a complicated history with Victoria. Some said he was Joseph's father. He was the one who led others to the farm that day, the one who first unlocked the barn door. People remembered how calmly he moved through the house, how familiar he seemed with the layout. Too calm, they said, too knowing. Police questioned him more than once, but nothing stuck. No evidence, no confession, just whispers that followed him until his death. Then came talk of drifters, escaped prisoners, strangers passing through the countryside, hungry and desperate. It's an easy answer, to blame the unknown, but nothing valuable was taken. And the way the killer moved through the house, the way they stayed, it didn't feel like the work of a stranger. And then there were the secrets no one wanted to speak of openly. Andreas and Victoria, father and daughter, an ugly, poisonous rumor that everyone in the village knew, but no one dared to confront. Court records even showed past charges of incest, charges that somehow had been dismissed. Was the killer someone who knew? Someone who hated them enough to make them all pay? Or was it closer than that? A rage born inside the family itself? No one could say, but every theory circled back to one truth. This crime was personal. The years rolled on, and with them, the theories. Detectives retired. Witnesses died. Evidence, what little there was, faded or disappeared. In 1923, the farmhouse was demolished. The land went bare, as if to erase what had happened there. But erasing the place didn't erase the questions. Even decades later, in the 1950s, investigators tried again. New methods, new interviews. Even the skulls of the victims were exhumed and sent for analysis. But no new answers came. The skulls were eventually lost, a final indignity in a case already defined by failure. People kept talking about Hinterkaifeck. The way the dogs barked for days, the footprints in the snow, the attic light that burned low even after the killings. Each detail fed the unease, the feeling that this wasn't just murder, but something darker. And maybe that's why the story has lasted so long. Not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. I've spent years thinking about this case, not because of the brutality, though that alone is enough to keep anyone awake at night, but because of the silence. The way someone could step into that house, destroy a family, and vanish. No arrests, no justice. Just a quiet farm in the Bavarian countryside, and a story that refuses to rest. There's a theory I've never been able to shake, that the killer wasn't an outsider, that it was someone the family trusted, someone they wouldn't run from, someone who could lead them, one by one, into the barn without raising alarm. And maybe that's why the crime has never been solved. Because to admit that possibility, that it was one of their own, was something no one wanted to face. Time has a way of burying truth. Witnesses die, memories fade, but certain places, certain crimes, they hold on. The Hinterkaifeck farm is gone now. The fields grow wild where the house once stood, but locals still talk about it, about the cold that settles there on quiet nights, about the feeling that someone is still watching from the edge of the woods. 6 people died on that farm, and in all the years since, the only thing that's certain is this: whoever did it, whoever planned it, carried it out, and lived in that house afterward, walked away, and they were never found. Maybe they stayed close, blending in. Maybe they left, carried their silence to another town, another life. Or maybe they were closer than anyone ever guessed. Someone people passed in the village every day, never knowing. I've told a lot of stories. Stories of killers caught and punished. Stories of justice, however delayed, finally being served. But not this one. Not Hinterkaifeck. Because this story isn't about closure. It's about questions. About how evil can sit quietly in the place, and how sometimes it never leaves. And so, more than a century later, the farmhouse is gone. But the silence remains. The silence of a crime that left no answers. The silence of neighbors who never spoke everything they knew. The silence of 6 voices taken too soon. And maybe that's the cruelest thing about Hinterkaifeck. Not just the violence, not just the fear, but the knowing that the truth is still out there, somewhere. Cases like this, they stay with you, not because of the blood or the headlines or the horror, but because of what they leave behind. Questions, doubt, a shadow that stretches across decades. I think about that farm often, about Andreas and Cecilia, about Victoria and her children, about Maria, the maid, who never even got the chance to unpack her bag. I wonder if the killer thought about them too. If, years later, they woke in the night and heard the sound of that barn door creaking open in their mind. If they ever felt the weight of what they'd done. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they carried that silence easily, like a coat over their shoulders. Maybe they lived an ordinary life, the same way they walked out of that farmhouse and into the night. That's the thing about evil. It doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor. Sometimes it looks like no one at all. And so the story of Hinterkaifeck remains what it always was. A silence you can't explain. A mystery without an ending. And a reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't want to be found. Thanks for listening. See you in the next video.